In the fog-veiled valleys of Tennessee, 1838, a strange story began to whisper through the hills. A story of 7 sisters who arrived one spring and never seemed to leave, not through age, not through death, not through the natural passage of time itself. They came quietly, their origins uncertain, traveling in a creaking carriage drawn by black horses. No one knew from where they came. Some said Virginia, others claimed from across the Atlantic. But from the first day, something about them unsettled the townsfolk. The 7 women looked nearly identical, each pale as ivory, each with long black hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. They spoke politely but seldom, and though they moved among people with grace, they left behind a chill that no sunlight seemed to warm. They purchased a large tract of land outside a town called Hollow Creek, where they restored a long-abandoned plantation house, a sprawling mansion wrapped in creeping vines and surrounded by overgrown magnolias. The sisters worked with surprising strength and speed, and within weeks, the property that had once been considered cursed came alive again. Lanterns glowed in the windows each night, music drifted faintly from within, and sometimes the echo of laughter carried across the fields. But to the townsfolk, there was something wrong about that laughter. It sounded too even, too rehearsed, as though all 7 voices belonged to the same throat. Over time, small oddities began to surface. The blacksmith swore that he had seen the eldest sister exactly as she appeared 10 years before, not a wrinkle or change upon her face. A seamstress recalled taking their measurements for dresses over several seasons. Yet the numbers had never shifted by even a fraction. A farmer once claimed he saw the sisters walking barefoot in the field during a lightning storm, their white gowns soaked through. Yet not one of them appeared to be touched by rain. He told the story once, trembling, then never again. The years passed, and the sisters remained. They didn't marry, didn't travel, and didn't seem to suffer from the illnesses that haunted others in that age. Children who had seen them grow old told their grandchildren that the same 7 figures still walked the hills, their beauty untouched by time. Fear turned to superstition, and superstition turned to legend. The people of Hollow Creek began to avoid the road that led to the mansion, muttering that the ground there was unholy, that the moon always seemed fuller above their land, and that the air smelled faintly of roses and iron, the scent of life and blood entwined. Then came the winter of 1853, when a wandering preacher arrived in town and heard the tales. Driven by faith or perhaps curiosity, he went to the sisters' estate to bring them back to the light. He was never seen again. His horse returned the next morning without a rider, eyes wide, foam frozen at its mouth. From that day, even the bravest men refused to cross the creek at night. By the time the Civil War swept across Tennessee, the mansion stood silent. Soldiers passing through found it untouched by decay, its doors open, candles still burning, but no sign of human life. In one of the upstairs rooms, they discovered 7 chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each draped with a white shawl and a single withered rose. Not one speck of dust rested upon them after the war. Travelers still spoke of glimpsing pale women in flowing gowns standing by the river at dusk, reflections in the water that didn't match the motion of the wind. No one dared approach. Over a century later, the story of the 7 Sisters of Tennessee remains one of the South's most haunting mysteries. Were they witches, immortals, or something far older than either name allows? The official records bear no trace of their birth or death, only the purchase of land in 1838 and the mysterious fire that reduced their home to ashes many decades later. Yet on nights when the moon glows too brightly over Hollow Creek, locals still swear they see 7 shadows moving through the trees. Never aging, never fading, forever bound to the secret that time itself could not claim. In the early spring of 1838, when Tennessee's hills were still soaked in mist, and the air carried the scent of pine and thawing earth, a carriage rolled into Hollow Creek, a quiet settlement that prided itself on simplicity and good manners. The carriage was an old European model, out of place among the muddy roads and log houses of the valley. Drawn by 2 black horses with glassy eyes, it moved without hurry, as though its passengers were untroubled by time or distance. Few people saw it arrive, but those who did would remember it for the rest of their lives. When it stopped at the edge of town, 7 women stepped down, each dressed in dark traveling gowns that brushed the ground, each wearing gloves despite the warmth of the season. They were beautiful, yet their beauty was the kind that made people uneasy, the kind that seemed too perfect, too controlled. Their faces were pale as candle wax, their hair black as coal, and their movements so synchronized that one might think them trained dancers or priestesses from some old forgotten cult. They gave no names that anyone could later recall, introducing themselves simply as the sisters. They spoke politely to the innkeeper, their accents faintly foreign, their words precise and deliberate. When asked where they had come from, the eldest smiled faintly and said, "We have traveled far enough." That answer, mysterious and unsatisfying, would echo in Hollow Creek for generations. The sisters stayed only one night at the local inn. The next morning, they purchased a large tract of abandoned land 2 miles outside town, an estate once owned by the Harrows family, whose line had vanished years before under grim circumstances. The Harrows plantation house, left to rot in the humidity and overgrowth, had been considered cursed ever since. Locals said strange lights had been seen through its broken windows at night, and no one dared to approach it. Yet the sisters chose it without hesitation, paying in gold coins so old that even the town banker could not identify their origin. Within days, workers were hired to clean and restore the decaying mansion. They spoke of strange happenings, of whispers that followed them through the halls, of shadows that moved against the light, of faint singing that drifted from empty rooms. Some left the job in fear, while others stayed, drawn by the promise of good pay and the strange calm the sisters carried with them. The women worked beside them, never tiring, never sweating, never appearing to eat or drink. They repaired walls, polished furniture, and cleared the gardens with an energy that seemed impossible. And at night, the mansion glowed with candlelight, though no smoke rose from the chimneys. When the renovations were finished, the sisters dismissed their workers with generous payment and closed the gates. From that moment on, no one was invited inside. The mansion became a world unto itself, silent by day, alive by night. Neighbors reported seeing silhouettes move behind the curtains, 7 figures gliding through rooms lit only by flickering lamps. Sometimes faint music could be heard, a piano, a violin, and a voice that sounded human but not entirely mortal. Curiosity spread through Hollow Creek like wildfire. Farmers, merchants, and housewives all had their own theories. Some said the sisters were European nobility fleeing a scandal. Others whispered they were mediums or witches. A few claimed they were angels or demons sent to test the town's faith. But no one dared confront them directly. When a curious group of young men tried to spy on them one night, they returned pale and silent, refusing to say what they had seen beyond the iron gate. Over the months that followed, small changes began to stir around the estate. The fields near their land grew greener and richer, crops doubled in size, and the creek that ran behind their home seemed to shimmer even under the dullest moonlight. But the animals that grazed nearby grew restless. Cows refused to drink from the creek, dogs howled at night, and hunters who ventured too close reported finding small, bloodless carcasses of rabbits and deer. In town, people started noticing something else. The same faces that had arrived in 1838 remained unchanged in 1848, then 1858. While others grew gray and wrinkled, they stayed frozen in youth, their beauty untouched by the passage of years. When someone dared to ask about it, the sisters would smile faintly and say, "We are blessed with strong blood." That phrase would become part of local legend, repeated in hushed tones whenever anyone spoke of them. Despite their unsettling presence, no one could deny the sisters' strange influence on Hollow Creek. When sickness swept through neighboring towns, Hollow Creek was spared. When storms destroyed nearby farms, their valley remained untouched. The townsfolk came to see them as both a curse and a shield, something unnatural, perhaps unholy, but also protective in ways no one could explain. Then, one autumn evening, a traveling doctor stopped in town, drawn by stories of these unaging women. He visited their mansion, claiming he wished to study their remarkable constitution. The sisters welcomed him politely, and that was the last time he was ever seen. His horse returned to town days later, his medical bag still tied to the saddle. The sheriff searched the estate, but the sisters met him at the gate and said calmly that the doctor had left for Kentucky. They offered tea and smiled so serenely that he believed them, or wanted to. After that, no one dared ask questions. The sisters continued their quiet existence, attending church on rare occasions, dressed in black lace, their veils covering their faces. Whenever one of them sang during the hymns, the air in the chapel grew cold. Even the candles flickered low. Years turned into decades, and yet the seven sisters remained exactly as they were. Children grew up hearing stories of their arrival, of their pale beauty and strange home, and of the warning every mother whispered, "Never go near Hollow Creek at night." The truth of their coming, whether born of darkness, curse, or ancient magic, was never uncovered. The only certainty was that since their arrival, the town had never been the same. The valley carried an unease that no priest could bless away, and the memory of those seven identical faces haunted Hollow Creek long after the last of its original people were buried in the churchyard. The arrival of the seven sisters in 1838 was not just the beginning of a legend. It was the beginning of a wound in Tennessee's history, one that would never heal, because time itself refused to move where those seven women walked. The years following the arrival of the seven sisters in 1838 wove a strange and unsettling silence over Hollow Creek. Though the mansion they had restored gleamed under moonlight like a pearl set in the forest, its windows remained sealed to the outside world. Only at dusk did life stir behind those curtains. Music faint and haunting drifted through the valley. A piano and soft harmonies that sounded human but not entirely so. The people of Hollow Creek did what frightened people always do: they pretended not to notice. Yet in small gatherings, around the general store, in churchyards, beside warm hearths, the whispers began. It started with a child's story. Little Mary Hensley told her mother she had seen one of the sisters standing by the creek at dawn, staring into the water. The woman's reflection, Mary said, did not move when she did. Her mother scolded her for telling tales, but she shared the story anyway. First with a neighbor, then with the pastor's wife, and by the next Sunday, everyone had heard it. The preacher warned against gossip, but his own wife crossed herself 3 times when he mentioned their names. Farmers working the edge of the sisters' land swore that the air grew cold near the property line. Even in summer, when heat shimmered off the fields, a chill hung over the creek that cut through their valley. Strange footprints, bare, slender, and always wet, appeared in the mud each morning, vanishing before noon. A hunter once followed them deep into the woods until he found a circle of stones blackened by fire, yet no wood had burned there. He left and never returned. A decade passed, and the whispers only deepened. The sisters remained untouched by age. The town's children grew into adults, yet the sisters were the same as the day they arrived, flawless, poised, and pale as porcelain. They came to town rarely, but when they did, time itself seemed to bend around them. Men lowered their hats, women bowed their heads, and dogs went silent. The sisters bought sugar, candles, and fabric, speaking with soft, measured tones. They never haggled, never smiled, and never lingered. Some swore they could hear faint whispers following their voices, like echoes spoken by unseen mouths. The town doctor, before his disappearance, had written in his ledger that their skin was cool to the touch, like stone after rain. He noted that their eyes seemed to change hue in different light, sometimes gray, sometimes green, occasionally tinged with a red shimmer when the sun fell low. No one ever saw the doctor again after he mentioned those words aloud. It was in those years that Hollow Creek learned the cost of its silence. Livestock began to vanish. Goats, calves, even a prized mare, found later in the woods, drained of blood. The sheriff blamed wolves, but the marks on the bodies were clean, almost surgical. A farmer's wife claimed she saw one of the sisters crouch beside a fallen animal, her mouth dark and glistening. The woman's husband forbade her to speak of it again, yet by morning, the story had already spread across town like wildfire. Still, no one confronted the sisters. Fear has a way of disguising itself as respect, and Hollow Creek was a respectful place. People prayed harder, locked their doors earlier, and built new crosses along the road to the mansion. Children were told bedtime warnings. Never follow the music in the dark. Never look at the house with both eyes open. The sisters became something between myth and curse, spoken of quietly, never written down, never challenged. By 1850, the town's oldest residents swore they remembered seeing women like them before, long ago in another part of the country. Rumors tied them to strange disappearances in Virginia, unexplained deaths in New Orleans, and a noble family in France that had vanished into air. No record proved any of it, but the resemblance in every tale was uncanny. A group of unaging sisters, traveling together, leaving behind silence and decay. The whispers began to take on faith-like qualities. Some believed the sisters were cursed by God. women punished for vanity or blasphemy, doomed to walk the earth forever. Others thought they were angels cast out for loving mankind too deeply. A few believed they were the last of an ancient line, older than the church itself. The preacher of Hollow Creek tried to calm his flock, but even he could not deny what he saw year after year. The sisters stood in the same pews at Christmas Mass, identical as ever, eyes lowered, hands clasped in perfect unison. One night, during a terrible thunderstorm, lightning struck the steeple of the church. The bell rang wildly before falling silent. When the villagers gathered in the rain to inspect the damage, they saw the 7 sisters standing at the edge of the cemetery, untouched by the downpour. The youngest turned her head and smiled faintly before they vanished into the mist. That image haunted Hollow Creek forever. Not long after, a traveling photographer visited the town, an inventor eager to test his new daguerreotype camera. The sisters agreed to sit for him, and he claimed it was the most extraordinary portrait he had ever taken. Yet, when he developed the image, the glass plate showed only the mansion behind them. Their chairs were empty. The photographer fled the next morning, leaving his equipment behind. The story of the vanished portrait became the most whispered legend of all, told around fires in hushed tones that made even the bravest men shudder. Years turned into decades. New generations came and went, but the legend of the sisters only grew. Their mansion, once a curiosity, became a forbidden place, a haunted relic of something unholy. Children dared each other to run to its gates, to leave a stone or note upon the steps. But few ever returned without nightmares. Some claimed they heard the sound of singing from within, others that the windows reflected faces that weren't their own. By the time the Civil War reached Tennessee, Hollow Creek was already half abandoned. The mansion stood untouched by cannon fire or flame, as if the war itself avoided it. Soldiers who camped nearby told stories of figures in white watching from the trees. When they entered the house after the fighting ended, they found it empty but pristine. Candles still burning, mirrors covered with black cloth, and 7 gowns hanging in a row, perfectly pressed, waiting for their owners. The whispered legend of the 7 sisters became part of Tennessee's dark folklore, a tale of immortality and dread, of beauty that defied nature. Some say the sisters never aged because they never truly lived, that they were echoes of something ancient, caught between time and eternity. Others say they still walk the earth, moving from town to town, forever starting anew where no one knows their names. What began as whispers in Hollow Creek became a myth carried through generations, a warning carved into the bones of Southern memory. Beware the women who do not grow old, for their secret is not life, but the refusal of death itself. The mansion of the 7 sisters stood on the outskirts of Hollow Creek like a monument to time's defiance. Built in the late 1700s, long before the sisters' arrival, it had once belonged to the Harrows family, a line that vanished mysteriously, leaving behind only the creaking bones of their house and a legacy of fear. Locals had abandoned the place decades earlier, calling it the Hollow House, because no echo ever returned from its walls. Yet when the sisters purchased it in 1838, the townspeople watched with a mix of dread and fascination as life seemed to return to that decaying shell. In the beginning, curiosity led many to wander close. From a distance, one could see the mansion's once faded white columns restored, its roof replaced, its gardens blooming again with roses that glowed faintly even under the moon. The air around the estate carried a fragrance no one could quite name. Sweet, but with an undercurrent of iron. During the day, the place looked almost peaceful, but after dusk, when fog rolled in from the creek, the mansion took on another life. Lights appeared in the upper windows long after midnight. Sometimes faint music floated across the fields, weaving through the trees like a memory refusing to die. The sisters never invited guests, yet people often found signs that someone had been watching. Footprints appeared near the gates, as though someone had come out to the road and stood there for hours. The local postman swore that every time he delivered a parcel, he could feel eyes following him from the upper balcony. He once tried to wave toward the window and saw a pale face there, watching, still as stone, until the curtain fell shut. He never returned. The mansion became an island in itself, a fortress of silence. The townsfolk learned to avoid its path, especially after nightfall. Even animals sensed it. Dogs howled when the wind blew from its direction, and horses refused to go near the road that led to it. The only sounds ever heard from within were the haunting notes of a piano and the soft hum of female voices. Some said they sang hymns, others swore they were incantations. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like prayer. There were stories about what happened inside. A worker who once helped restore the foundation claimed he saw something strange in the basement. 7 coffins carved from white oak, each lined with silk, each bearing no name. When he told others, the sisters paid him to keep quiet, and within a month, he left Hollow Creek forever. Another rumor told of a merchant who delivered fabrics to them and returned pale and trembling, insisting that every mirror in the house had been covered with black cloth. "They don't want to see themselves," he whispered, "because what looks back isn't what we see." Time inside the mansion seemed frozen. While the town aged, while children grew and old men died, the mansion remained untouched. Paint never peeled, the gardens never wilted, and the candles that burned at night never seemed to shorten. The house breathed in its own rhythm, as if alive. Some said it drew its life from the land, feeding off the fear and awe of those who whispered about it. Others believed the sisters themselves kept it young, sustained by something unnatural, a pact perhaps, sealed long ago in blood and silence. No one knew what the sisters did all day. They were never seen outside before sunset. When the sky turned gold, they appeared on the balconies, their long dresses fluttering like ghosts in the wind. They would stand there in perfect stillness, sometimes for hours, gazing toward the horizon as if watching for someone or something to arrive. When the sun finally dipped below the trees, they would vanish inside, and the house would awaken. Children who dared sneak near the gates told stories that spread through Hollow Creek like wildfire. They said that at night, the house glowed faintly from within, not with the warm flicker of candlelight, but with something colder, like the shimmer of moonlight on water. They claimed to hear laughter, soft, synchronized, and distant, and sometimes a cry, sharp and human, quickly silenced. One boy, Thomas Avery, swore he saw one of the sisters floating above the staircase through the front window, her feet not touching the floor. No one believed him, but his hair turned white before he turned 20. As the years passed, the mansion became a symbol of the unexplainable. People began to mark the boundaries of its land with crosses and salt, believing it kept whatever dark power lived there contained. Yet despite the fear, there was also fascination. Young men in Hollow Creek often bragged about sneaking near the estate, though few actually did. The few who did were never quite the same afterward. They spoke softly, slept poorly, and avoided mirrors. There was one woman, a seamstress named Eliza Moore, who claimed to have been invited inside. She told the town that the sisters were gracious and beautiful, but their presence filled the air with a weight that made it hard to breathe. She said their eyes seemed too knowing, their smiles too still. When Eliza returned home, she fell ill, wasting away over weeks. Before she died, she whispered that she had seen something in the mirrors that no one else could. 7 shadows, all moving at once, though only one body stood before her. After that, no one spoke of entering the mansion again. The war came and went, yet the sisters' home remained untouched. When soldiers looted the countryside, they skipped Hollow Creek. Some said their commanding officer had warned them that the land was cursed. Others claimed that one of the sisters had met the soldiers' eyes and they had turned back in fear. The house stood through cannon fire, storms, and generations of decay, a perfect, preserved relic of something that refused to die, even after the mansion burned decades later. Witnesses swore that the fire itself seemed unnatural. It didn't spread like ordinary flame, it glowed white, almost cold, and consumed everything in silence. When morning came, only ash remained, and beneath it, 7 hollow spaces in the earth, shaped like the outline of coffins. No bones, no bodies, no remains. Just the emptiness left behind. Today, locals say that when the fog settles over the old Harrow's grounds, the outline of the mansion can still be seen, faint, like a ghost's reflection. And if one listens closely, they claim to hear faint piano notes echoing through the trees, and 7 voices humming in perfect harmony. The mansion of the 7 sisters was more than a home. It was a prison for time, a sanctuary for secrets, and a wound carved into Tennessee's soul. Its walls never simply held people. They held what people became when they defied nature. In its silence, the legend of the sisters grew roots, and from that silence, the whispers that haunted Hollow Creek were born. Nathaniel Crowther arrived in Hollow Creek in the autumn of 1842. a man of science in a place ruled by superstition. He was in his early 40s, with sharp gray eyes and a reputation for reason that bordered on arrogance. The townsfolk whispered that he could diagnose madness by looking into a man's pupils, and that he never lost a patient unless death himself insisted. But when he first heard of the 7 sisters, those eternally young women living in that shadowed mansion beyond the creek, his curiosity took hold of him like a fever. At first, he dismissed the stories as rural fantasy. Tales of women who never aged, who sang to the moon and glowed in candlelight, belonged to the delirium of uneducated minds, not to the ledger of a physician. But the more he heard, the more he realized that every version of the story shared one chilling consistency: the sisters had not changed in appearance since 1838. No wrinkles, no gray hair, no frailty. It had been 4 years, and those who had seen them said they looked exactly the same. For a man like Crowther, who spent his life dissecting the boundaries between flesh and soul, this rumor was irresistible. He began by studying records, reading through church documents and census notes. He found evidence that 7 women had indeed arrived in Hollow Creek in 1838, purchasing the old Harrow's mansion under the name the Mrs. Dufresne. There were no birth records, no family histories, no evidence of their origin. They had come from nowhere. And what was stranger, the deed to their property had been signed by a man who died 50 years earlier. The doctor laughed at the clerical error but noted it carefully. Mistakes, after all, had a way of leading to truth. His first visit to the mansion came under the pretense of a medical call. He claimed to have received word that one of the sisters was ill, though he never said who had sent the message. The gates were open when he arrived, and the air seemed to shift as he stepped through. The path to the house was lined with white lilies, their scent almost chokingly sweet. Every step forward felt like entering another world, quieter, slower, almost timeless. When the door opened, 6 of the sisters stood waiting. They greeted him warmly but without surprise, as if they had known he was coming. Each woman was beautiful in a way that felt unnatural, faces flawless but faintly hollow, eyes bright yet distant. Their smiles were soft, practiced. The 7th sister appeared last. She was different, darker, haired, with an intensity that pinned him where he stood. She introduced herself as Clara and asked why he had come. Crowther explained his medical concern, but Clara only smiled. "Doctor," she said in a voice both tender and sharp, "we are not the kind of women who fall ill." He should have left then. But the scientist in him refused. He studied them discreetly. Their skin without blemish, their movements fluid and unhurried, their temperature strangely cool when he shook hands. He asked their age, and Clara laughed. "Old enough to remember the birth of your nation," she said, and the others smiled with her, their laughter echoing softly down the hall. Over the next weeks, Crowther returned again and again, always with excuses, delivering medicine, inspecting air quality, studying soil samples. Each time, the sisters welcomed him but revealed nothing. Yet something about the house changed him. He began to dream strange dreams after each visit, of endless corridors, of voices humming in languages he did not know, of a heart that beat beneath the floorboards. He started losing track of days. His assistant, a young apprentice named Matthew, noticed the shift. The doctor stopped attending patients in town, his notebooks filling with scribbled symbols and fragments of words like vita perpetua, eternal life. He spoke of biological stasis, of cellular perfection, of a discovery that would race the boundary between science and God. The townsfolk began to whisper again. They said the doctor had fallen under the sisters' spell. Others claimed he was trying to expose them. Whatever the truth, one stormy night in late October, he packed his instruments and told Matthew he was going to prove it all. He rode out toward the mansion and never returned. 3 days later, his horse was found wandering near the creek, saddle torn, reins blood-stained. His bag was discovered by the water's edge, containing only a single item, a locket that no one had ever seen before. Inside was a lock of dark hair and a note written in his hand. "They are not alive as we are. Their blood is clear as glass and it sings. When the sheriff organized a search party, they refused to cross the mansion's gates. Even in daylight, the house seemed to pulse with unease. A few men swore they saw movement behind the curtains, shadows gliding like smoke, and though the doctor's body was never found, that night 7 candles burned in the upper windows, one more than usual. Weeks later, The mansion sent a letter to the town, written in perfect penmanship and signed by Clara de Fresson. It read only Dr. Crowther has gone to rest. His work continues within us. After that, Hollow Creek changed. The air grew heavier near the mansion, and sometimes the fog carried a faint humming sound, like a man's voice trying to join 7 others in harmony. Some said it was the doctor, bound forever to his discovery. Others said he had become one of them, preserved in their endless twilight, neither dead nor alive. Years later, when the mansion finally burned, the townsfolk found something in the ruins. A single scalpel fused into the stone floor, its blade engraved with words so faint they were nearly gone. Eternal flesh, eternal debt. Crowther's disappearance became one of the unsolved horrors of Tennessee's forgotten past, but for those who still lived near Hollow Creek, the story was not a mystery. It was a warning. Curiosity, they said, is just another word for hunger, and some hungers were never meant to be fed. By the winter of 1843, Hollow Creek had learned to live in silence. The mansion of the 7 sisters stood untouched, its pale walls reflecting the moonlight like bone. No one spoke openly of the women anymore, not since Dr. Crowther vanished. Yet something lingered in the air, something that hummed low and strange, like a prayer spoken backward. The elders said it began that December, when the moon turned red and the river froze solid overnight. It was then that the villagers began to see them, the sisters, in the woods at night. It started with a young trapper named Illy Pruitt. He was out checking his snares near the northern ridge when he saw 7 figures moving among the trees, their white gowns glowing faintly in the darkness. At first, he thought they were spirits, but when he crept closer, he realized they were singing, softly in a rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat. The sound wasn't human. It vibrated in his chest, made his teeth ache. Then he saw the circle's 7 stones carved with symbols that shimmered like frost. The sisters stood around it, hands clasped, heads bowed, as if calling something from the ground. Eli fled before dawn, his traps abandoned. When he stumbled into town, he swore his beard had gone half gray overnight. No one believed him, not entirely, until others began to hear it too. On nights when the wind died and the sky went black, the forest would echo with faint chanting. Dogs refused to go near the woods. Children spoke of seeing candlelight among the trees. One farmer claimed his daughter woke screaming, saying 7 women were standing at her window, their eyes glowing like coals. The sheriff, pressured by the townsfolk, rode out one evening to investigate. He took 4 men with him. None of them spoke much about what they saw, but the next morning they were pale as ghosts and refused to return. The sheriff burned his uniform and resigned the next day. They weren't praying, he said in a shaking voice. They were feeding, as winter deepened. The forest itself seemed to change. The snow melted around those 7 stones even in the coldest nights, leaving the ground bare and black. Animals disappeared. Birds avoided the area. A hunter found a deer completely drained of blood, its body unmarked. Rumors began to spread that the sisters were not merely immortal. They were sustained by something older and hungrier than life itself. One night, a preacher named Josiah Graves decided to confront them. He believed the sisters were witches, and that Hollow Creek was under their curse. With a Bible in one hand and a lantern in the other, he set out into the woods, his wife begging him not to go. He was never seen again. Days later, his lantern was found hanging from a tree branch, still burning, though the wick had turned to ash. The next full moon brought the truth to light, or as close to it as the living would ever see. A group of townsfolk gathered near the ridge, determined to witness what Eli Pruitt had seen. They waited until the moon rose, and then they heard it a low, throbbing hum. When they looked through the trees, they saw the sisters again, 7 white figures moving around the stone circle. This time the moonlight struck their faces clearly. Their eyes were black, their lips dark with something that glistened. One by one, they knelt beside the stones and pressed their hands to the earth. The ground seemed to breathe beneath them. Then came the sound, a crack like thunder, and the air turned cold. A shape rose from the soil like a mist taking form. The witnesses fled screaming. They swore that what came out of the ground had Dr. Crowther's face. After that night, no one dared approach the forest again. Even during the day, the air around the ridge shimmered faintly and strange symbols began to appear on trees, carved deep as if by invisible hands. The townsfolk began marking their doors with crosses made of ash, and the preacher's church filled with trembling prayers. By spring, the sisters stopped appearing in daylight altogether. The mansion's windows were shuttered, and the gardens grew wild and overrun. But every month, when the moon turned full, the same haunting glow would appear in the woods. 7 white figures dancing in silence, as if time itself had forgotten them. Years later, long after the town had emptied and nature reclaimed Hollow Creek, travelers passing through the ruins spoke of an unease that lingered in the trees. Some claimed they heard faint singing from deep within the forest. Others found strange stones buried in the ground, covered in symbols no scholar could translate. And though no one alive remembered the Defresne sisters by name, the people who lived near the valley had one rule, whispered to their children before bed. If you see 7 lights in the woods, do not count them. Just close your eyes and pray the song passes you by. The ritual had never stopped. The sisters had never aged, and whatever they had called from the earth that night, it had never gone back. By the summer of 1844, Hollow Creek had transformed into something unrecognizable. What had once been a quiet southern town tucked between hills now stood divided between those who worshipped the Defresne sisters as divine and those who whispered that they were devils. Something strange had taken root in the land, something alive, breathing, pulsing beneath the surface. It began subtly, almost beautifully. The soil around the sisters' mansion grew richer, darker, more fertile than anywhere else in Tennessee. Flowers bloomed out of season, thick and heavy with scent. The cornfields doubled in size. Vines curled over fences and crept along the ground, blooming with pale, crimson-tipped roses no botanist could name. To the desperate farmers who had watched their land fail for years, the sisters' property seemed like a miracle. Then came the livestock deaths. At first, the farmers blamed wolves, but the bodies told another story. No torn flesh, no broken bones, only 2 small punctures and the eerie absence of blood. The same crimson roses that surrounded the sisters' estate began sprouting near every site where an animal was found dead. The pattern was unmistakable. It was as if the land itself had developed a hunger, and it fed through beauty. When questioned, the sisters never denied or confirmed anything. They simply smiled with that same serene calm and said, "Our life must give to live." The townsfolk began to divide into factions. Some claimed the sisters were healers who could control nature. They believed their mansion was sacred ground, a place blessed by angels who took the form of women. Others swore it was cursed, that the sisters had struck a bargain with something buried beneath Hollow Creek, something that fed on blood and gave life in exchange. One farmer, Samuel Briggs, desperate to save his dying crops, trespassed onto their property one night. He brought with him a sack of seeds and a single promise, that he would do whatever it took to bring his fields back to life. He never returned home. A week later, Samuel's wife found her husband's seeds sprouting in their barn, roots tangled around a human hand, bone white and blooming with red petals. She burned the entire structure down that night and left Hollow Creek before dawn. Then came the rain, the kind that never should have fallen in midsummer. It came heavy and metallic, like thin sheets of rust-colored mist. Afterward, the grass turned lush but darker, almost black. Even the trees seemed to glisten unnaturally, their bark bleeding sap that smelled faintly like iron. By this point, no one could deny that something unnatural had fused with the soil. The sisters' gardens grew higher than the fences. Their orchard bore fruit so rich that travelers claimed one bite could make them forget sorrow. But the price was there too. A man who ate from those trees found his reflection vanishing from mirrors for a full week. Another man lost the color in his eyes after drinking wine offered by the sisters. It was Clara, always Clara, who appeared to be their voice. She would visit the edge of town every few weeks, wrapped in black lace, offering baskets of fruit and flowers. Those who took them home found strange peace, no nightmares, no illness. But soon after, small things began to disappear from their homes: a pet, a photograph, a crucifix from the wall. Those who refused her gifts claimed to see her shadow at their window long after sunset. By early autumn, the earth around Hollow Creek had changed entirely. The crops nearest to the mansion were lush and thick. The fields farthest away turned gray and brittle. Even the river that ran through town grew sluggish, its water darker, its banks lined with strange vines that glowed faintly at night. And then, for the first time, the sisters opened their gates, A great gathering took place one night under the full moon. Dozens of townsfolk came, drawn by equal parts curiosity and fear. The sisters stood before them in pale gowns, their hair loose and shimmering in the moonlight. Clara spoke softly, but her voice carried through the night like wind through glass. "The earth," she said, "is waking. It remembers the first blood, the first breath. We are only its daughters, its caretakers. You may share in its bounty if you give it what it asks." When one man asked what the earth desired, Clara smiled. "Whatever you no longer need," she said. The next morning, every garden in town had bloomed overnight, and every family had lost something. Some a pet, others a possession, and one mother her child. After that, Hollow Creek began to empty. Families packed their belongings and fled, leaving houses to rot. But those who stayed found themselves bound to the land, unable to leave no matter how far they traveled. One woman claims she reached the next town but woke the next morning back in her bed, dirt under her fingernails. By 1846, the mansion was the only place left untouched by decay. The roses had grown wild, swallowing the fences, and the air carried a faint sweetness that made visitors dizzy. When the sheriff organized one last attempt to confront the sisters, his men found the mansion empty, every room filled with vines and flowers blooming in impossible shapes. But the sisters were not gone. That night, 7 new trees appeared on the mansion's front lawn, tall, pale, and smooth as marble. Locals who dared to approach swore they could hear whispers when the wind passed through their leaves. The ground beneath them pulsed faintly, as though something alive still breathed below. Years later, nothing remained of Hollow Creek but the ruins of the church and the faint outline of the mansion's garden. Yet every spring, red roses still bloom there, unnaturally vivid, untouched by insects, and impossible to kill. They say the sisters still walk among those flowers at dusk, 7 white figures whispering to the soil, feeding it what it demands, ensuring that blood and bloom remain forever bound. And if you stand there long enough, they say, you can hear the garden breathe. By 1847, the legend of the 7 sisters had spread beyond Hollow Creek. Travelers passing through Tennessee carried whispers of immortal women, a cursed mansion, and a valley where flowers bloomed in blood. Word reached the ears of Auguste Leclerc, a French painter known for his fascination with beauty that bordered on obsession. Leclerc had made his name painting the faces of nobility across Europe, faces that outlived their owners, eternal on canvas. When he heard of women who never aged, his curiosity turned into hunger. He declared that if they truly defied time, then he would capture their truth, not just beauty, but eternity itself. When Leclerc arrived in Hollow Creek, the town was nearly dead. Homes stood empty, vines crept through doorways, and the air felt heavy with a perfume that never faded. He stayed in the abandoned inn by the church, painting by candlelight and sketching what little remained of life there: a rusted gate, a cracked fountain, the faint outline of 7 trees standing where the mansion once glowed. On his 3rd night he saw them, 7 figures gliding through the fog, pale, graceful, otherworldly. They moved toward the ruins, their gowns brushing the ground without stirring dust. Leclerc followed, trembling, clutching his sketchbook. When they reached the old mansion's courtyard, they stopped. One of them turned to him, Clara. Her eyes caught the moonlight like glass. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Leclerc bowed deeply. "Mademoiselle," he whispered, "forgive me, but I must paint you. The world must see such beauty." She studied him for a long time, her gaze neither warm nor cold. Then, to his shock, she nodded. "If you paint what you see," she said softly, "be sure you can bear what it shows you." The next morning, when Leclerc awoke, he found a carriage waiting for him outside the inn. No driver, no horses, only an open door and the faint smell of roses. Against all reason, he stepped in. The world blurred around him. The next moment, he stood in the courtyard of the de Frezin mansion, whole again, restored, as if time had folded back on itself. Inside, the sisters waited. They sat in silence as he unpacked his easel, their expressions unreadable. The light in the room never changed. It glowed as if the sun itself was caught behind frosted glass. He painted for days, sleeping only when exhaustion forced him to. Every time he looked up, the sisters were there, perfectly still, their beauty undimmed. But the more he painted, the more he noticed something impossible. The colors on his palette shifted. The reds darkened to brown, the whites to pale gray. Even his brushes felt colder. By the 5th day, the painting was nearly done. Yet when he looked upon the canvas, he felt dread instead of pride. The faces he had painted were exquisite, but wrong. Their eyes seemed alive, as though watching him back. The shadows behind them twisted faintly, suggesting shapes that did not belong to any human form. He tried to add light, to soften the faces, but every stroke only made the image worse. That night, Clara came to him alone. "You've seen too much," she said quietly. "Do you still wish to finish?" Leclerc, pale and trembling, nodded. "To leave it undone," he said, "would mean I never truly saw you." She smiled sadly. "Then you shall see all of us." The next morning, the painter was found wandering through the town square, barefoot and incoherent. His hands were streaked with paint, his eyes wide and glassy. When someone asked what had happened, he whispered. They stood still, but the painting moved. The canvas was discovered days later in the ruins of the mansion. It was flawless, every detail rendered in breathtaking realism. But the longer one stared, the more the image shifted. The sisters' eyes followed you across the room. Their lips seemed to tremble, caught between a smile and a scream. And worst of all, their reflections appeared in the painting even when no one stood before it. Leclerc took the portrait back to France, determined to preserve it. He locked it in his studio, covered in velvet cloth. But soon his apprentices began to notice strange things. They heard whispering from the covered frame at night. Paintings nearby would fade overnight, their subjects turning blank and pale. When Leclerc finally unveiled the sisters' portrait again, it was gone. The frame remained, the paint cracked and dry, but the canvas was empty. Terrified, he burned his studio to the ground and vanished from Parisian society. Some said he went mad. Others said the sisters reclaimed what was theirs, their image, their likeness, their power. Decades later, in 1893, a museum in New Orleans reported receiving an unsigned portrait from an unknown donor. The painting was blank, yet its surface shimmered faintly under moonlight, as though something beneath the paint wanted to surface. Curators noticed that anyone who spent too long near it grew faint or began to hum a tune they couldn't remember learning. Today, the portrait is lost again. Some claim it hangs in a private collection under a false name. Others believe it still resides in Tennessee, hidden in the ruins of Hollow Creek, waiting for another artist foolish enough to uncover it. They say if you paint near those woods, your canvas begins to fill itself, with faces you didn't draw, eyes you didn't imagine, and a beauty too terrible to belong to this world. And when you try to destroy it, the sisters appear in your dreams, smiling, whispering in the dark. What fades from the canvas lives forever in us. By 1889, the town of Hollow Creek had been swallowed by time. What was once a proud plantation settlement now existed only as a name etched faintly in the corner of old maps, a ghost town that locals refused to speak of. The Dufresne sisters, who had once ruled that land like queens of their own eerie kingdom, had not been seen in over 40 years. Most believed they were dead. Others whispered that death had refused to take them. The world had moved on, railroads replaced carriages, cities grew, and memory faded. But the curse that had begun in those shadowed Tennessee woods was not finished. One summer evening, a traveler named Henry Wilcox entered New Orleans, his face pale, his manner uneasy. He was a cotton merchant, respected and rational, a man known for his business sense rather than superstition. Yet when he began telling his story at a cafe near Chartres Street, his voice trembled with something deeper than fear. He claimed to have seen the impossible. Henry explained that while traveling through Tennessee months earlier, he had strayed from the main road in search of a shorter route. His local guide refused to continue past a stretch of dense fog, warning him that the land beyond was cursed. Where the 7 women walk, untouched by time. Henry laughed off the legend, believing it to be nothing more than backwoods folklore. He went on alone. As he rode deeper into the wilderness, the air grew colder and a strange silence blanketed the world. Not a single bird sang. When the fog lifted, he saw the remains of a grand plantation house. It stood in ruins, walls crumbling beneath the weight of ivy and decay, yet something about it seemed alive. The vines pulsed faintly, as though breathing. Henry tied his horse and walked through the overgrown gates. The ground was soft beneath his boots, the earth strangely warm. Inside what had once been the main hall, the scent of lilies hung thick in the air, not the fresh kind but sweet and rotten like flowers placed too long on a grave. Then, from somewhere behind the collapsed staircase, he heard the faint sound of music. It was a woman's voice humming, When he turned toward it, he saw her, a woman standing among the ruins, framed by the moonlight. Her hair was black as ink, her skin so pale it seemed carved from marble. She wore a black dress of old-fashioned lace, the kind fashionable half a century earlier. Yet she looked young, ageless, untouched by time. "Forgive me?" Henry said, startled. "I thought no one lived here," she smiled faintly. "No one does," she replied. "But some places remember us too well to let us go." Her accent was faintly French, soft and melodic, like the whisper of another century. She introduced herself simply as Clara. The name sent a strange chill through Henry. It was familiar, though he couldn't place it. She invited him to rest, offering a small glass of deep red wine. When he hesitated, she said, "It is not poison, it is what remains." Her words made no sense, but her tone was calm, mesmerizing. They sat together beneath the shattered ceiling as twilight deepened around them. She asked him questions about the world beyond. The trains, the lights, the cities filled with noise. When he mentioned the invention of electricity, her eyes lit with curiosity. "So man has found a way to steal lightning from the heavens," she said softly. "How clever, and how foolish." As darkness fell, he realized how quiet the forest had become again. Not a single sound except her voice and the low hum of the air. He looked around and thought he saw movement beyond the trees. Shapes, faint and still, like 6 other figures standing in the mist. "Are you alone here?" he asked. Clara turned her head slowly toward the window. "Never," she whispered. That was when the scent of lilies grew stronger. He stood, heart pounding. When he looked back, she was gone. Only her voice remained echoing faintly from the trees. "Remember what you saw, and forget what you know." Henry fled the ruins in terror. He rode through the night until dawn broke and the fog lifted, and when he looked back, the path he had taken no longer existed. He could never find it again, no matter how many times he tried to trace his steps. Months passed, but he could not shake her image. He dreamed of her every night, her pale face, her eyes like storm clouds, her soft humming beneath the moon. Then one evening, at a grand ball in New Orleans, he saw her again. She stood on the balcony overlooking the Mississippi, wearing the same black lace gown. She looked exactly as she had that night in Tennessee. Not older, not changed, not even by a breath. Henry froze. "Oh," he whispered. She turned, expression calm. "Do I know you?" "Yes," he said. "I saw you at Hollow Creek." Her smile faded, replaced by something almost pitying. "That place no longer exists." When he reached for her hand, it was cold. Not the cold of death, but the stillness of something outside life altogether. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am what remains when time forgets," she said softly. "I am the echo that never fades." Then she leaned close, her breath like frost on his ear, and whispered words no one ever heard him repeat. She vanished into the crowd before he could follow. That night, Henry collapsed in his hotel room. His friends found him shaking, muttering about the 7 who walk and the woman who drinks memory. He stopped sleeping. He drew strange symbols on his walls and claimed to see Clara's reflection in every mirror. Weeks later, his body was found floating in the river, a note clutched in his hand. It read, "Clara lives. The others are coming." In the years that followed, reports spread across the South. People swore they had seen 7 women, dressed in black, ageless and beautiful, appearing at night on quiet streets, always together, always silent. Wherever they went, people fell ill, their memories fading, their dreams filled with humming voices and the scent of lilies. By 1895, they were no longer spoken of as ghosts, but as something else, something living that refused to die. They had adapted. They no longer needed the shadows of Hollow Creek. They walked among cities now, feeding not on blood, but on memory, on longing, on the awe of those who stared too long. And even now, when fog creeps over the riverbanks and the air smells faintly of lilies, some swear they see them walking. 7 women in black, faces pale, eyes like moonlight. They do not look back. But if one of them meets your gaze, she will smile, and you will feel a strange familiarity, as if you've met her before, long ago. In a dream you've forgotten, and from that night on she will visit you there. By the winter of 1852. The legend of the Dufresne sisters had become the kind of story mothers whispered to their children to keep them home after sunset. People avoided the road that passed their estate, especially at night. The mansion, once grand and beautiful, now stood like a skeletal monument to something unholy. Windows were shattered, vines choked the walls, and every door hung crooked on its hinges. Still, on certain nights, faint lights could be seen flickering through the cracks, candlelight, or something like it. Then came the fire. It began on a bitter January evening. The sky hung low and gray, the ground frozen hard as stone. A farmhand named Amos Price was returning from the river when he saw the first column of smoke rising above the trees. He thought at first it was a brush fire, but as the glow spread across the sky, his heart began to pound. The Dufresne mansion was burning. By the time neighbors arrived, the blaze had devoured half the estate. The fire raged with a violence that seemed unnatural, roaring louder than any storm. Some swore they saw shapes moving within the flames, figures dancing, or struggling, or perhaps simply watching. Yet there were no screams, no cries for help, only the crackle of fire and the low hum of the wind. When dawn came, nothing remained but ash and blackened beams. The grand staircase had collapsed into a pit of coals, and the portraits that once lined the hall had burned to gray ghosts on the walls. The sisters were gone. The townspeople waited for someone to emerge from the ruins, but no one did. Days passed before a group of men gathered the courage to search the remains. Among them was Sheriff Langley, a practical man who'd never believed the gossip about witchcraft or eternal youth. "We'll find bones," he told the others grimly. "Everyone leaves bones." They began their search at first light, shovels and lanterns in hand. The air reeked of smoke and iron. As they dug through the remains of what had been the parlor, they found strange things: melted glass bottles filled with dried herbs, a cracked mirror that reflected no image, and a set of 7 iron candlesticks arranged in a perfect circle on the stone floor. When they reached the basement, something stranger awaited. Beneath the foundation was a small, hidden chamber sealed with iron doors. The hinges had melted from the heat, but the men managed to pry them open. Inside was a narrow passage lined with stone walls. At the end of the passage, they found 7 coffins. They were old, older than the house itself, judging by the wood and nails. Each one was carved with symbols no one recognized. There were names etched faintly into the lids: Clara, Evangeline, Marie, Odette, Josephine, Lizette, and Amelie. But when the men opened the coffins, they were empty. Not a bone, not a trace of ash, nothing. The men looked at one another in silence. Sheriff Langley's lantern flickered, and for a moment, he thought he saw something glimmering in the corner. A faint movement, like fabric shifting in the dark. He turned quickly, but there was only the empty stone wall. "Seal it," he said finally, voice trembling. "Shell it and leave it." They did as he ordered, filling the passage with rubble and covering it with soil. By nightfall, the ruins of the Dufresne mansion were quiet again. But none of the men slept that night. Each one claimed to have heard the same thing in their dreams: the soft sound of footsteps on stone and 7 voices whispering in unison. Weeks later, the town began to change. Animals refused to graze near the burned estate. Wells ran dry. The air around the ruins grew colder, even in daylight. Some nights, travelers claimed they saw figures standing where the house once stood. 7 silhouettes, motionless, framed by the dying light of the moon. Sheriff Langley tried to dismiss the stories, but one evening he received a letter with no name and no return address. The handwriting was delicate, flowing, unmistakably feminine. It read, "Do not mourn what cannot die. Do not search for what wishes to remain unseen." He burned the letter immediately, but its words never left his mind. In the months that followed, a few brave souls ventured to the ruins. A schoolteacher who collected local history found an old ring in the ashes, a silver band shaped like a serpent biting its own tail. He took it home, polishing it until it shone. Within days, he fell ill. His wife said he began to speak in his sleep, murmuring in a language she couldn't recognize. Before he died, he whispered one name: Clara. The ring vanished after his burial. By the late 1860s, nature had reclaimed the land entirely. The foundations of the mansion were buried under moss and thorns, the once manicured gardens overrun with vines. Travelers sometimes stopped there without knowing the history, resting near the river where the estate once stood. Many spoke of a strange unease that settled over them, as if they were being watched. Then, on the 40th anniversary of the fire, a child went missing near the ruins. His body was never found, but his sister swore she saw a woman by the river that night, a pale woman with black hair dressed in old lace. She smiled at the girl and said softly, "He's gone where the light never fades." The sheriff who investigated found footprints in the mud. 7 sets leading from the water toward the forest, but never returning. After that, the townspeople finally did what fear had kept them from doing for decades. They built a church over the site of the old mansion, hoping to bury the curse beneath holy ground. The preacher blessed every stone, every nail, every inch of soil. But on the day the church opened, a fire broke out again, small, controlled, but strange. It burned only one thing: the floor above the old basement, where the 7 coffins had once rested. When the ashes cooled, the preacher found something in the center of the scorch marks, a fresh lily, white as snow, untouched by flame. He left it there, understanding that some things do not end with fire of faith. Some things linger, waiting, remembering. To this day, people in that part of Tennessee say the earth still feels warm near the old church. On foggy nights, travelers swear they hear music rising from the ground, faint and sorrowful. And if you stand there long enough, listening closely, you might hear the whisper of 7 voices calling your name, as if inviting you to join them, forever unburned, forever unburied. Time has a strange way of softening horrors. The stories that once made people tremble become bedtime tales. The names that once inspired fear turn into curiosities in dusty archives. But in Tennessee, there are certain whispers that never die, and the legend of the 7 sisters is one of them. Even after the fire, after the graves were found empty, after the last witness grew old and died, something of the sisters remained. It was as if the land itself could not forget them. The valley where the DeFressin mansion once stood became a place where compasses failed, where fog settled without wind, and where silence felt alive. Travelers who took the long road along Hollow Creek often spoke of strange sensations, the feeling of being watched, or the faint echo of laughter carried through the mist. Some even claimed to have seen figures walking near the water at dusk, 7 women in black, their faces veiled, their feet never touching the ground. In 1912, a group of historians from Nashville came to document the region's old plantation ruins. Among them was a young woman named Lydia Hartwell, a researcher fascinated by Southern folklore. She had read the surviving accounts of the DeFressin sisters, their mysterious origins, their supposed immortality, the fire, and the 7 empty coffins. Lydia didn't believe in curses. She believed in patterns, in stories shaped by human fear and imagination. Yet when she arrived at Hollow Creek, her certainty began to waver. The first thing she noticed was the quiet. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, even the river seemed to move without sound. The air was colder there, though the sun hung high above. As her team set up camp near the ruins of the old church built over the mansion site, she found herself staring at the earth, noticing faint depressions in the soil, like footprints long forgotten. There were 7 of them, perfectly spaced, leading toward the woods. That night, while the others slept, Lydia walked alone to the river. Moonlight shimmered across the surface, and the reflection of the trees rippled like a painting disturbed by breath. She felt drawn to the water's edge, though she couldn't say why. Then she saw them. Across the river stood 7 figures, cloaked in darkness, motionless. Their outlines were unmistakable, slender forms draped in lace, hair glinting faintly under the moon. Lydia's heart froze. She blinked, and they were gone. The river was empty again, silent, still. The next morning, she told no one. Instead, she returned to the ruins, determined to find proof. As she dug near the church foundation, she unearthed something strange. A piece of blackened wood engraved with a symbol, a circle of 7 lilies surrounding a serpent devouring its tail. The same serpent ring mentioned in old records. When she touched it, the ground seemed to hum faintly beneath her fingertips. That night, a storm rolled in. Wind tore through the camp, scattering notes and lanterns. Lydia awoke to a whisper, a soft, melodic voice calling her name. She rose and saw the shadow of a woman standing beyond the trees, her face hidden but her posture graceful, familiar. Lydia followed, barefoot, the mud cold against her feet. The woman moved slowly, gliding rather than walking. When Lydia reached the clearing, the woman turned. Her face was pale and beautiful, her eyes deep as the river itself. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly. "The ground remembers." "Who are you?" Lydia whispered. "I was Clara once," the woman said, her lips curving faintly. "We were 7, and we were bound by love and by something older than love." Lydia's breath caught. "You're the curse," Clara interrupted. "Or perhaps the price." Lightning flashed, illuminating 6 more women behind her. Identical faces, ageless, serene. The storm howled, but they stood untouched, their dresses unmoving in the wind. Clara stepped closer. The fire did not free us. The river did not wash us away. We remain because the world still remembers our names. As long as memory binds us, we linger. Lydia trembled. "What do you want?" "Nothing from you," Clara said gently. "But when you write of us, write the truth. We are not monsters. We are what men made us when they sought eternity and forgot mercy." Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the seven turned and walked toward the river. With each step, their forms grew fainter until they dissolved into mist. When Lydia blinked, they were gone. Only the lilies remained, 7 of them blooming where her footprints had been, though the ground was frozen. By morning, the storm had passed. Lydia's colleagues found her sitting near the river, pale and quiet, staring at the lilies. She never spoke of what she saw that night, but when she returned to Nashville, she wrote an essay titled, "The Curse That Lingers, a Study in the Persistence of the Unseen." It was never published. The manuscript was found in her desk after her death years later, the final page missing. But one line, written in her careful script, remains famous among Southern folklore scholars. A curse survives not because of magic, but because of memory. What we refuse to forget will always live among us. Over the years, more stories emerged. A preacher claimed he saw 7 women walking by the river on Easter morning. A hunter swore he found footprints in the snow that led to the water and vanished there. A little girl visiting her grandmother's farm said she saw ladies made of light, smiling at her through the fog. Even into the 20th century, people spoke of strange things happening in Hollow Creek. Cameras malfunctioned, compasses spun, and every attempt to rebuild on the old estate failed. Machinery would break, walls would collapse, or workers would fall ill without cause. Locals said it was the sisters' way of protecting what was left of their home, their grave, their secret. Now the valley lies empty again. The river runs quiet, and trees cover what was once the church and the mansion before it. But if you walk there on a full moon when the fog curls low and silver across the ground, you might see them. 7 women, walking in silence, their faces calm, their eyes reflecting centuries of sorrow. They do not harm, they do not speak. They simply walk side by side, bound by memory, by loss, by the echo of time that refuses to let them go. And if you are foolish or brave enough to follow them, they will lead you to the riverbank where lilies bloom even in winter. The air will feel cold, but the ground beneath your feet will be warm, as if the earth itself still remembers their footsteps. Then you might hear it, a faint hum, a melody without words, the sound of 7 voices singing a song older than the town, older than the fire, older even than death. And when you turn to leave, you will carry that song with you, a whisper that never fades, reminding you of what Lydia Hartwell once wrote, that curses do not die when the body does. They live in stories, in memory, and in the places that refuse to forget. In Tennessee, the valley still remembers, and on moonlit nights it still breathes their names.